Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Welcome to episode 43 of the Feeling Good podcast. And today we're going to be talking about Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder, or OCD as it's better known. But before we get to this, I just wanted to make sure, David, that you could put in a couple announcements for, you have some intensives coming up this July.
Yeah, that's the best teaching of the year, and I'm going to be doing two 4-day summer intensives. They're similar, but a little bit of difference. I'll explain. From July, 17, 18, 19, 20, I'll be in Banff,
and that's 2017
Canada.
For those who are listening 2 years from now.
Yeah, right. Hopefully I'll still be around 2 years from now doing another one somewhere. But that'll be up in Banff, Canada. That's apparently just a fabulous vacation area. And the 4-day intensives are always my best teaching of the year. It gives.
I can attest to that.
Yeah, and it gives you a lot of chance to practice techniques. I'll demonstrate techniques, and then you can practice them in small groups and get feedback. There's also will be videos of dramatic therapy sessions, excerpts, so you can see people changing before your very eyes quickly, people who have had years of suffering after horribly traumatic events. The one in Canada is nice because there's no evening sessions, but typically we end up with volunteers from the group who want to go hiking in the evenings. Mm-hmm. This gives people a chance for getting some personal one-on-one time with me, doing personal work, case consultation. They're really fun. And then from July 31st to August 3rd, I'll be doing one in Burlingame, California. That's the South San Francisco summer intensive. And that one is great because there's evening sessions. So you get extra practice time, more live demonstrations. People from my Stanford Tuesday training group will be there to help out with the small group exercises. So that's pretty much the event of the year.
And you still do some hikes by the bay shore and at lunchtime.
Yes, we may have time to fit in some hikes there too. Now, if you're interested in the Banff one, you can call Jack Hirose and Associates. I don't have his website here, but you can find the link on my website on the workshop page. But if you want to call him toll free for information, that's 1-800-456-5424. Now, the one in Burlingame, California, is sponsored by IAHB.org, and you can go to their website or link to them from my workshop page. Or if you want to call them, it's 800-258-8411, 8411.
Okay. So to summarize, we have July 17th to 20th, 2017 in Banff, Canada. And we have July 31st through August 3rd, 2017 in South San Francisco, California. And both of those you can find under the workshop page on feelinggood.com.
Perfect.
Great. So moving on to today's topic, I think that today's topic is quite in line with the series we just did on the uncovering techniques, because we did the downward arrow, the individual downward arrow, the interpersonal downward arrow, and the what-if technique. But there was a fourth technique that we didn't really discuss very much, the hidden emotion technique. But you're going to fold that into talking about OCD today. Right. So I think this is quite in the sequence of what we did before. So what is OCD?
Right. Well, OCD is one of the more unusual forms of anxiety. OCD is Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder, and there's generally two components to it. And most people are familiar a little bit with mild OCD in our own personal lives. The obsession means that the person gets an irrational thought that they can't get out of their brain, some frightening thought. It might be mild, like you put the letter in the mailbox, and then you have the thought, well, gosh, what if the letter didn't drop in all the way?
Yeah.
And you start worrying, and the person won't get my letter.
Or what if I didn't put a stamp, or...
Yeah, all that kind of stuff.
Or what if I didn't put my return address and it's going to get lost, and, all that.
Yeah, and so then the compulsion is a ritual that you get involved with to try to undo the anxiety, to relieve yourself. And so you might go and check and open the mailbox there and make sure it has fallen in. And you may even get to doing that two or three times. And that's called the compulsion. And the compulsion is actually kind of an addiction, actually, because the ritual you do to undo the obsessive fear, it gives you temporary relief. And so then you get addicted to doing that. And I've had a lot of OCD patients that I've treated over the years, and we can talk more about it. But one of the things that OCD patients, are terrified of is that someone would hear about their symptoms and laugh at them. And I have to confess,
because they know that it's irrational, but yet they can't stop themselves.
And but I have to confess that every time I've had a new OCD patient who described their fears and their rituals, it was hard not to burst out laughing, and that probably makes me seem like an insensitive, horrible psychiatrist or horrible human being. But there is that humorous component. But to the person who's suffering, it's very horrible.
It's not funny at all. Yeah,
very, very real. But we'll give some examples. But let's read these questions from listeners.
Yes, because we have some listeners who wrote to us on that very topic, and that will guide how we respond back to this. The first one here is from Rajesh, who says that he's asking whether OCD can be cured 100%, because he says it also seems to be organic. And he says, I have seen it very hard. It's very hard to get rid of some compulsive rituals for a patient with OCD. He also says, I know exposure techniques work, but there's a relapse as well. And besides, the patient might like some motivation to work on their compulsive ritual due to some benefits that are perceived. So that's one of the questions. Another one comes from Onkar, and he says that he was diagnosed with OCD and reading your book.
And what's the first name of the person?
Onkar.
Onkar?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And he's from India. He says, and he's reading your book, Feeling Good, but he says that Feeling Good barely talks about OCD and more about depression, and he's asking for some referrals about OCD.
Which book, maybe?
Yeah, which book would be good for that?
Sure.
And then we have another one from. This is from. I don't think we have a name for this question. This listener writes that he hasn't seen, or she hasn't seen, a therapist specifically because he doesn't want to go on medication or anything like that. He would like to do the therapy himself. The question is that he gets anxiety and what he calls the OCD guilt complex over thoughts rather than the specific things. For example, thinking that I'm a horrible person for flirting with someone while I'm in a relationship, even though my significant other has specified that it is okay and to move on. He gets anxiety about things in the past and then ruminates over and over, thinking that if I think about it, I can get every detail that will let me know if I'm in the wrong. And then I finally convince myself that I'm anxious and it's okay. It revisits me in a few days and the cycle starts over. So it's creating a tension in his relationship and so on. So yes, he's saying that, it's not about material events, but about thoughts. And if I think this way about this thought, then I'll think better. And it seems to be like a vicious circle.
Oh, yeah. These are definitely things to trap. We'll give quick answers, and then we can really talk about the treatment. Rajesh asks if it's organic and if it can be cured 100%. And we don't know the cause of any psychiatric disorder, but I think we can say that it's very likely that all normal and abnormal human conditions have a genetic contribution as well as a psychological, environmental contribution. We were talking
nature and nurture.
At lunch, you talk about let's take the disorder shyness. There's an animal model for shyness, and again, I don't have the research reference to this article, but it's one I read a number of years ago. I'm sure one could find similar references, research studies, but there was some work on pointer dogs that have a fear of humans, human phobia, we can call it, from the moment of birth, depending on whether or not they have a particular gene. And if they have this gene for what's called homophobia, but we think of that as fear of homosexuality.
I like to call it anthropophobia, to use the Greek root for
anthropophobia, human phobia. Yeah. But at any rate, if they carry this gene from the moment they're born, when they first see humans, they cower, they shiver, their tail goes between their legs, and they hide. They're terrified of human beings. If they don't have this particular gene, when they're born, when they see a human being, they rush over, they're excited, they lick your face, they're perfectly happy and relaxed and excited. So that would be a 100% genetic model for what we think of as shyness. So all of these conditions may have a significant genetic contribution, just as if you're outgoing and happy, that's probably largely genetic as well. But I think the good news is that whether these things have to what extent they're genetic and biological, to what extent they're psychological or environmental, my focus is more on treatment and on cure. And the answer to your question is, I think that we can cause dramatic. I see, familial anthropophobia in pointer dogs. You found it there, August 1979. Way to go! Right on Google. That is cool. And but yes, I have seen pretty much complete elimination of symptoms in patients in obsessive-compulsive disorder. Sometimes pretty quickly, actually. Sometimes it takes a little while, but purely with psychological techniques, I don't see medication as being necessary in the vast majority of cases. And you
don't think that anxiety medication like Xanax and things like this?
Well, the Xanax and things like that, I think are absolutely should not be used. That's my opinion.
Right.
I'm just stating my own personal way of doing therapy, because they're addictive and they're in no way curative for any anxiety disorder. Right. They give you some temporary relief, but then you get hooked on them. But I'll talk about some of these really fabulous techniques for treating OCD, because they're incredibly interesting, actually, and kind of fun. Which book, Onkar asked, wasn't finding it in Feeling Good. Two of my books cover anxiety disorders. One is called The Feeling Good Handbook, that I wrote 8 years after I wrote Feeling Good, and that has a lot on anxiety disorders, including the hidden emotion model that we'll be talking about today. And also my book, When Panic Attacks. It's like Feeling Good, but it's on all of the anxiety disorders, including OCD, and it has 40 techniques for defeating every conceivable kind of anxiety. So that would be a good one, too, for people who are trying to do self-treatment for an anxiety disorder.
Yeah, When Panic Attacks has a lot of techniques in there. I really like that book.
Yeah, well, my daughter edited it, and she was a great editor, so it's actually better written than some of my earlier books.
Yeah.
So should we
look at the hidden emotion? Yeah, because I think that a lot of people are curious about.
Let me just start out by saying, in our earlier podcast, I mentioned that I don't have one treatment for a disorder.
Right.
And I think that's an error in the field,
Right.
is to think that you're going to have this treatment for depression, this technique for depression, and this technique for anxiety. I use 50 to 75 techniques I've developed or learned, and they could all be helpful for people with any diagnosis. But when I'm treating any form of anxiety, I use those 4 treatment models. I'll use the cognitive model.
Yeah.
I'll be using 10 or 12, cognitive therapy techniques. I'll be using the hidden emotion technique always. I'll be using the motivational approaches, dealing with outcome and process resistance that we've talked about in previous podcasts. And I'll also use the exposure and response prevention techniques. A lot of people treat OCD with exposure and response prevention, for example, thinking
exclusively.
And I think that's a huge error, because although exposure and response prevention are helpful for many patients with OCD, they're rarely completely curative. And we have all these other powerful tools, and if you use all these tools together, you maximize your opportunity for the near 100% or near 100% elimination of symptoms.
Yeah, and I would like to refer our listeners back to podcast episodes 22 and subsequent ones in our series that we call Scared Stiff, that goes over all of these different models for anxiety.
Yeah.
So
right.
That would be a good review for people who to know what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Now we could look at these models in any particular order, but we can kind of dive in on the hidden emotion model again as one of the 4 strategies I use in treating OCD, and I think listeners will find it illuminating. And the basic idea behind it is that certain of us are kind of programmed from birth or from upbringing to think we've got to be so exceptionally nice to everyone all the time. And most of the time, when you have someone with any anxiety disorder, including OCD, you're working with someone who's like extraordinarily nice. And while it's really fun and pleasant to interact with a nice, pleasant person, we had someone came on a Sunday hike. A young man came up from Southern California who has a kind of a OCD type of thing, and he's preoccupied with excessive sweating. I'm thinking somehow this makes him, abnormal or undesirable. But he was just this incredibly nice fellow, really pleasant and fun to interact with, and a delight to work with. And I think he made some tremendous progress on that. In fact, I mean, kind of going astray, but one of the techniques that was helpful to him, among many others that we did on the hike, we went for dim sum afterwards.
Yeah.
And then help him get over his shame. We asked him to approach strangers.
Right, a shame attacking exercise, like we talked about last time. Yeah.
Yeah, and say, by the way, I want you to know that I sweat like crazy because I'm a real nervous guy, and I'm even sweating now, and you can just see like the sweat breaks out on his face. And I told him, and then also tell people, and the reason I'm telling you is because I've been hiding it all my life, because I'm really kind of ashamed of it, and really kind of shy. And so he was a good egg, and he did this a couple of times in the Chinese restaurant, and so then as we were leaving, I said, tell these three guys, because they were kind of like gangster looking guys, and so he went up to them and said, listen, and by the way, this is a very handsome fellow, and he's he's not. He looks like he's got it all together. Like one of the beautiful.
You would never doubt it. Suspect that this is going on. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I said, go up and tell these three guys. So he's really kind of terrified, and he goes up and he starts saying, I want you guys to know that I've had this problem with sweating, and I just sweat like crazy sometimes, and I'm really kind of really anxious, worrying about it, and thinking people are going to be offended, and I'm almost trying to hide it. And so today I decided I wasn't going to be ashamed anymore, and I'm just going to start telling people, and that's why I decided to tell you guys. And by the way, as he was talking, these guys look angrier and angrier, like they're some gang members. They're going to like beat the tar out of us or something, And then when he finished, this fellow reached out and hugged him. And he said, "I am so proud of you." He says, "I just came out 2 months ago, and I just think you're fantastic." And he had tears in his eyes.
Hey.
And this kid, he just couldn't believe it, that this thing that he'd been so ashamed of, when he opened up and shared this in this kind of humble and kind and open way, instead of being turned off, suddenly somebody feels so close to him. And it's absolutely the truth that his flaw. See, I would be intimidated by a kid like this because he's in some fraternity and he's going to become very wealthy.
Right, yeah.
Do you know what I'm talking about? And he's handsome.
He's got everything going for him, yeah.
Yeah. And so you kind of automatically feel like he's not my kind of person. Like I don't like him. He's not going to like me. But then when he shows his vulnerability, suddenly you feel so close to him.
In this particular vignette, I think that there's something more to it, because the other guy hugged him not simply because of the vulnerability, but also because of the courage to admit it. Yeah. I think that was the key point.
Which had taken courage in his life too to talk about
exactly. So he could resonate with that. Yeah.
But at any rate, that's the kind of person you see. He's just so nice and so worried he's going to be offending somebody. And the thing about the Dynast model is that often under the surface of the symptom of anxiety, in his case kind of intense social anxiety, but also especially true in OCD, there's some emotion that the person is not expressing, that they're kind of bottling up. Mm-hmm. And if you can help them get in touch with that suppressed or repressed or hidden emotion and verbalize it, often you'll see a marked improvement, often a total elimination of the symptoms of anxiety, including OCD. And it's great to know about this model, because I would say 99% of the people who are treating OCD are not even aware of this treatment technique, which is so healing for so many people with OCD. So I'm going to give some 3 or 4 vignettes here to bring this to life. And then in the next podcast, we can talk about, exposure and response prevention with some really fantastic vignettes as well. But I was referred and I'll disguise things a little bit, but
as you usually do,
like let's say here I was referred a Stanford medical student who was just an absolutely top medical student, but he had been treated for years for OCD. And his obsession was that he would have this thought, I wonder if I've gotten AIDS or HIV in some way. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't any rationale for it, because he was engaged, he and his fiancée were faithful to each other. But he would think, oh, well, maybe I drew blood on a hospital patient with HIV and then pricked myself with a needle and then forgot.
Yeah.
And he'd say, well, how can I know for sure that didn't happen? Like, it could have happened. And he'd work himself into a state of intense anxiety, and then he'd go to the library and start reading journal articles on OCD to see if he had this symptom or that symptom. No, I mean on HIV.
On HIV, right, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
On AIDS. And eventually he'd go to the emergency room and persuade them to do a blood test for HIV. And of course they always came back negative, and then he'd be relieved for a few days until
it came back. Yeah.
So
there's never full relief when you indulge your compulsions. Yeah.
Yeah. And so again, the obsession is this belief: maybe I'm dying of AIDS, and the compulsive ritual in his case was going to get a blood test to get relief. Well. Other faculty members had treated him with all of their best stuff and had made no dent in it whatsoever. And I was using all my cognitive stuff and my exposure and response prevention, all this stuff, but I wasn't making a dent in it. I'd had about 8 or 10 sessions with him, and then he called me on a Saturday in an emergency, and it suddenly crossed my mind what was going on. We'll ask the listeners, see if they can figure it out. We'll have them turn off once I give the hint here.
Right. So make a pause here and pause the podcast.
Yeah, see if you can figure out what the hidden emotion was. But what he called me and he says, Dr. Burns, it's Saturday and I'm having the overwhelming compulsion to go to the emergency room and get a test for, a blood test for an HIV because I have this fear that I'm dying of AIDS. And I said, well, Tell me what's going on. And he said, well, I've got some exams next week, and my fiance had a reunion up in New England or something. She's going to fly up to New England for a high school reunion, and it made sense for me not to go with her because I've got to stay home and study. But 15 minutes after she left, I started feeling like I was dying of AIDS, and now I just can't. I'm just fighting this compulsion to go and get a blood test. And I think I needed an emergency session. And at that moment, it just hit me like lightning what the hidden emotion was. And again, to help you out a little bit as listeners, what the hidden emotion model says is that some of us are nice. We think we have to be nice all the time. And so if you have an emotion that you think you're not supposed to have, it comes out indirectly. You sweep it under the rug, and instead of admitting to yourself how you're feeling emotionally, you
become anxious.
Huh?
Yeah, you become anxious.
Yeah, you become anxious, and it can be a panic attack. It can be, in his case, OCD. It can be a phobia. I've seen it with like an airplane phobia, fear of flying. Or chronic worrying about your family. It can be anything. So what I would say now is ask yourself, what was this medical student not admitting to himself? And just put the pause button on your recording device. If you're not driving, if you're at home, you might even just jot down a couple things. But I'll give you some hints. The hidden problem is never buried in the past. Mm-hmm. It's buried in the present. It's something that's happening, yesterday or today. It's something very recent that's bothering the person. And a second hint is that the form that the anxiety takes is often a symbolic expression of what the suppressed feeling or hidden problem is.
Okay, so let's reveal the answer.
Okay, but have they turned off the tape recorder
yet?
Well,
we don't know.
Sound device?
We don't know.
Well, turn it off now.
We're hoping they do.
Make a guess. And by the way, don't worry about making a wrong guess, because usually your guesses will be wrong, but only the patient can come up with it. So, but it's important to make a guess so you can get your patient thinking along these lines, even if you can't get exactly what the thing is.
Okay.
So they've
now.
turned it off, paused it off,
okay.
And now they've turned it back on?
Yeah.
Okay. So here's the thing. I told him, listen, we'll call him Ralph. I tell you what, you want an emergency session. Why don't we have an emergency session first thing Monday morning? But what I want you to do is come in with your girlfriend. You said she's coming back Sunday night. Uh-huh. And I'd like you to come in with her, because I think I know what the answer is, and my hypothesis was that when she left, he started to get real lonely and upset in some way. It could have been anger because she's going to a reunion without him. It could have been loneliness, but some emotion that he wanted, that he felt that, he shouldn't have, or he shouldn't express that. And so he came in with his girlfriend, and I encouraged them just to do some kind of marital therapy 101. They're engaged, and, mm-hmm. It's just some couples express your feelings. What did the other person say? And I just encouraged him to say how he really felt. And And what was going on with him is that he felt really lonely. He kind of wanted to tell her, although I have to stay home and study, I'm going to be really lonely with you, and I kind of wish on some level you weren't going. And he said, the reason I didn't think I could say these things is I thought it was unmanly, and that you would think less of me, that meant I was kind of weak.
So he could not admit to feeling lonely. That was the hidden emotion.
Yeah,
loneliness.
Vulnerable.
Yeah,
that he's supposed to be a man. A man is supposed to be strong, and so he took the courage with my little suggestion to do this as an experiment. And then when
how do you think that he admitted to that so readily? I mean, if he would not admit it to himself,
I told him. I talked to him first. I said, "Do you think this is going on?" And then I said, "Would you be willing to express this to her? Because this is what I think you must do to defeat the OCD." So
once you put it to him, he admitted it to himself.
Yes. And then I said, "I think you've got to bring this into your relationships with other people."
Yeah.
And so but it was terrifying for him to do this.
Yeah.
And this is like a form of exposure.
Right.
To expose who you are as a human being. And then when he told her that, she burst into tears and put her arms around him and said, I can't tell you how grateful I am to hear you talking like this. Mm-hmm. It makes me love you so much. And I've just been waiting, for us to be able to relate on this level, and he couldn't believe it, and it blew his mind. And at the end of the session, he says, "Dr. Burns, I'm cured. My fears of AIDS and HIV, it's totally disappeared for the first time in 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
He'd been struggling with this and seeking treatment unsuccessfully." And I said, "Well, Ralph, the good news is you're now, permanently and irreversibly and totally cured of OCD. And it only took about 3 minutes in the session for that to happen. And the even better news is your OCD will come back over and over for the rest of your life." And he said, "Well, why is that the even better news?" And we might ask the listener again now, before we give you the answer, why is that so desirable for him to have these fears of AIDS and to come back? Do you know why, Fabrice? You probably do.
Well, before answering that question, if it's going to be coming back over and over again, how could you say that he's cured?
Well, we can actually, but the listener has to figure out, why is it highly desirable for him to have this tendency?
Well, I would say that for somebody who works in a medical environment, it's good to be vigilant about infections, no?
No, that's not it. What it is, that's certainly good common sense, but that's not hitting the nail on the head. You see, what it is that he'll probably never know in real time what his feelings are. And so when he's not expressing his feelings to somebody, he will develop the belief that I'm dying of AIDS. And that's his body's way of tipping him off. You're not expressing something you need to express. And so he said, whenever for the rest of your life you start to get this feeling, I'm dying of AIDS, that's a great thing, because that's your body's mechanism, your body's way of telling you that you're not owning up to something, and then you can figure out who you're upset with and express the feeling, and then it will disappear.
So you're looking at that as the alarm bell.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so you're kind of, again, reframing it. It's not an illness anymore. It's an asset that you have. It's your body's way, kind of like pain, of telling you, hey, take your hand off the hot stove, but this is a different kind of signal.
I would say that, allow me to kind of expand on this. Negative emotions like anxiety and depression are also alarm bells. What they're telling us is that we are attaching to some negative thought that is distorted.
Yeah, that's true too.
So the alarm bell says there's a distortion in there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's another way of looking at it. Well, that was, I saw him one more time for a little relapse prevention training, and I never heard from him again. And then surprisingly, I got a phone call from him about 6 months ago.
Oh, okay.
And he said, "Do you remember me?"
How long ago did you first see him?
40 years ago.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I got some, he said, "Do you remember me?" I said, "My gosh, how long has it been?" It seems like it's been about more than a week or two, because I could remember every conversation. It was like I'd just seen him 7 days
Well, you have a
earlier.
great memory, David. Yeah.
Well, for these things, I forget people's names, I forget people's faces, but I never forget their souls. And so I said, "Oh, this is fantastic. How are you doing? And what are you doing now?" He says, "Well, and again, I'll disguise this slightly, but he says, I'm the chairman of the Department of Cardiology at Harvard Medical School." Because he had been like first in his class. He was kind of a genius guy.
Right.
And I said, "Well, how's your OCD?" And he says, "Oh, it's just exactly what you said." He said, 99% of the time, I'm 100% cured, with no symptoms whatsoever. That 3 minutes in your office was changed my life when I opened up to my girlfriend, who's now my wife. But he said, every now and then I'll get the idea that I'm dying of AIDS, and I'll get all this creepy feeling, and I'll think I've got to go and get a blood test. And then I did what you told me to do. I go through my appointment book hour by hour, and I say, who am I pissed off at? Who am I? And then I'll figure out who it is, and I express my feelings, and then instantly it disappears.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And then I said, "Why are you calling?"
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And he said, "Oh,
I've been listening to your podcast."
Yeah, he says, "I've been doing research on anxiety and cardiac symptoms, and I was wondering if I could use your Burns anxiety inventory in my research." I said, "I'd be honored. Go for it." Yeah. But it was so cool. But that would be one example of the hidden emotion. Of the hidden emotion technique. It's such a cool technique and so helpful, I think, to all of our listeners who struggle with any form of anxiety. I think it could be really neat to give a few more vignettes, OCD examples with hidden emotions.
Maybe one or two, because we're coming to the end of our
Well,
podcast.
I'm thinking maybe we could finish this one and then and do a few more of these. It wouldn't hurt to have another podcast on hidden emotion.
I guess,
technique.
yeah.
Because, I don't know. For me, they're fascinating.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So,
all right. Well, good. So we'll do the next vignettes in the next episode, I guess. And I would like to remind our listeners, if they like our podcast, and numbers seem to indicate that people are signing up to listen to it, to show your support. Please click on the subscribe or leave a review button at the bottom of the show notes, or go directly from your iTunes program into ratings and reviews. You can also support us by forwarding the feelinggood.com podcast page to friends, talking about it. And especially, please leave some comments in the show notes so that we know what you want to hear about and what's of interest to you. So all those are ways for you to support us. Okay.
So thank you, Fabrice. It's always a pleasure.
All right. Thank you, David. This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.